So everyone's looking at this Lucy Letby case now, and I think instinctively we all understand it's a huge and abhorrent crime, and I think that somewhere maybe in the human mind we sort of expect large explanations for such things. We expect to be able to be told this is the reason and have it make sense. But I suspect many of us are going to be disappointed if we proceed down that avenue of thinking, aren't we? What kind of things has this thrown up to you in terms of that all-encompassing explanation of her behaviour?
Yeah, well, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? That's, as you say, Stephen. That's what people want to know. Why did she do this? And I don't know if we'll ever know, because she is at this point completely denying it, protesting her innocence. And I think that's not going to change anytime soon. If she ever does admit to what she's done, I think it'll be years and years down the line, possibly even decades. So what the best that we can do is rule out other kind of similar situations, right? So I'm sure yourself and the viewers would have heard of like Beverly Allitt, Harold Shipman are probably two of the most similar cases. So Beverly Allitt also was a nurse, and in Lincolnshire, I believe 1991, she was charged with 4 counts of murder and 3 of attempted murder of babies. And it was remarkably similar to Lucy Letby. So it was air bubbles, it was insulin, literally the same method. So with her, she had Munchausen's by proxy. I'm sure a lot of your viewers will have heard that term. So basically, that's when somebody is quite connected to being a victim. So Munchausen's is when they fake their own illness, physical illness, so they get attention from friends, families, doctors, nursing staff, etc., etc. And by proxy, as it sounds like, means that you do that through another person, another victim. So that's what Beverly Allitt was doing. Completely different from Lucy Letby. She wasn't trying to kind of get any attention to the children's sickness at all. Then you look at Harold Shipman, and I believe he had some sort of God complex. So I think he got a thrill. He almost got off on being the one that kind of gets to decide who lives or dies. And I think that's sort of perversely connected to his own mother. So his own mother had lung cancer. Harold Shipman was present when she died. He would give her morphine. So I think he somehow conflated the emotions of dying with love. And I think maybe there's an element of that with Lucy Letby, but it doesn't quite fit the picture. She didn't seem to have this God complex. She wasn't like massively narcissistic. What she did was obviously hugely selfish and entitled, but in life in general, she wasn't narcissistic. So I'll give you quite a long-winded answer here, but if you take away those things, then in my view, what's left behind as potential motivators for Lucy Letby are a number of things, right? So it could be simply power and control, which, I mean, it's something that people like me say. I don't know if it's really, if that means anything. What kind of power trip would you get from killing babies? But it's certainly a possibility. I wonder whether she was in some way kind of connected to the grief. So I said that Munchausen's by proxy is being connected to being playing the victim role. But there's something about Lucy Letby from what I've read, where she was always there when parents were grieving. She always appeared. She'd be part of that process. She would write them. She would check them out on Facebook. She would write them letters of sympathy. Sometimes she's even present when it wasn't her patient. So when it was babies that belonged to another nurse. So I wonder whether that's part of it. And I suppose another logical thing might just be jealousy. So she said many times that for every reason she doesn't believe that she'll ever be kind of married, or she'd have this family unit. So it could be just as simple as destroying something that she was jealous of. So she's trying to annihilate it. And then finally, Stephen, my last kind of speculation would be, I wonder if there's something about her that gets off on fraud. So when I say that, when I see some of the cases that I assess, you get these fraudsters, obviously, that are motivated by money. That's pretty straightforward. But you get some that kind of get off on the thrill, like a superiority complex of fooling other people. And I do wonder whether there was an element of that with Lucy Letby, because she was always, as I said, she was present in the grieving. So I wonder if she felt that she was somehow tricking people by being the cause of their baby's death, but also the person that was there to comfort them.
Yeah, and I mean, and what you say makes a lot of sense, but I suppose it's very hard to get people to understand who don't live in this world. And I'm one of these people that don't live in this world. You clearly are a person that does live in this world. To get people to understand the full range of extreme human behavior. So, I mean, what you're describing here, we're not venturing into sort of supernatural explanations. We're talking about real documented things that people can experience and manifest. And it's not entirely within your field of research, really. This sort of behavior or motivating psychology is not particularly extraordinary, is it?
Sorry, what you mean? The motivations that I talked about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that if you cover all of those bases that I talked about, so, you know, from the God complex to Munchausen's to the power and control to the kind of obsession with grief to jealousy of the family unit, I think that pretty much anybody that commits these kind of offences, so caregivers, healthcare professionals that have killed, pretty much all of them would fit into one of those categories, I think. So yeah, it's not that unusual.
Currently having a mini debate in this country at the moment about sentencing and whether or not the the defendant should be present at the time, and Lucy Letby wasn't. She wasn't there for sentencing, of course, and that gives, it almost feels like the justice system's been robbed a little bit of closure, the general public as well, in getting to see her, hear the verdict and things like that. Where are you on this in terms of someone's psychological rights, or perhaps I think it's probably a human rights issue as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so I've got, the honest truth is I've got quite mixed feelings about this. I have absolutely no sympathy for Lucy Letby or anybody that does anything like what she's done, but my issue with forcing people to come in isn't because I don't think that they have a right to bypass that process. My issue is that we're making an assumption that she would listen, that she would go there, she would be receptive, that she would, accept or at least listen to what's being said. What happens if you've got somebody who does the opposite? Now, Lucy Letby is not particularly, aggressive or impulsive, and her behaviour has not been errant in court. But supposing you have somebody that shouts over the judge, or that just uses it as another excuse or another opportunity to protest their innocence again, or even baits or mocks the victim's family, which does happen. You get that. You get these perpetrators who just don't give a shit, who are proud of what they've done. Again, I don't think Lucy Letby's like this, but that's my issue with forcing people to come. We're assuming that it will help kind of give justice to the victim and their family, but it could potentially, I think, do the opposite. It could actually make it more traumatic. It could be like the opposite of catharsis. If you're telling somebody, reading out your victim impact statement and they get the sentence, if they don't care, and if they make a mockery of the whole thing, then I think it could hurt justice rather than add to it.
That's a really good point, actually, that I hadn't considered. Yeah, it could be used as a platform, couldn't it? Could be used to inflame and enrage the situation worse, if that's even possible. But I suppose the general public will probably instinctively understand on some level that she's got some very bad software running on her brain, however that's defined and explained psychologically. I suppose what they'll really struggle to get their head around, though, is the fact that it went on for so long, and concerted efforts were made to raise the flag, and they were, silenced, in some cases reprimanded. And it seems to me as well, I mean, it didn't necessarily take Columbo to put the pieces together. It was a very straightforward, establishing correlation on something as basic as a rota to find her as the common denominator in all these deaths. Yeah, it went on for so long and nobody really, raised the alarm. Have we got an issue with the sort of bureaucracy in the NHS that could be very dangerous in situations like this?
Yeah, absolutely. So my thoughts are probably the same as what most people think, that it's a travesty that the hospital managers managed to sweep it under the carpet, or even tried to sweep it under the carpet in the first place. I suppose it's really hard for anybody to accept that a nurse would do this, right? And that's why this is such a big deal. This is why it's such a high-profile case. I struggled to accept it when I first heard about it. I literally thought, this can't be true. Somebody like her couldn't do something like this. That's what I thought initially before the evidence came out. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is I can understand, I can sympathise to a degree if the managers were kind of burying their heads in the sand and they just find it hard to accept that this statistical anomaly was happening. But I think it's inexcusable for them to have ignored the concerns that were raised by the doctors. The only thing that I can possibly imagine is that they cared more about the image of the trust than they did about trying to find out what was causing this extra baby death. Because I can't imagine that they would want more babies to die. That just seems, like a ridiculous concept to me. So I think it is incompetence. I'd like to think it's incompetence rather than malice. But I suppose we don't know for sure. What do you think?
I think it's interesting as in terms of how the NHS is perceived in this country. I mean, regardless of whether you're pro or against or indifferent or critical, I think there's a sort of religious, sort of deferential attitude towards the NHS. And I think that puts people off being vocally critical of it in any way. It's not the same thing, but it's kind of similar to the attitude in the Catholic Church, and a lot worse was going on there. There seems a very protectionist mentality of the NHS just from a public perspective. I don't know if you get that. I mean, you'd probably know better, having worked with the NHS fairly closely.
Yeah, it's weird because, like, on a societal level, everyone is always protective and complimentary about the NHS. So, if you go on YouTube comments, for example, and everybody talks about all the hard work that doctors and nurses do, which they do, but on a day-to-day basis, because I work in the NHS, I work in a court diversion scheme in London. It doesn't feel like that on a day-to-day basis. So another way of saying that is that people seem quite happy to complain about things, and things are ineffective, like even in the system that I work in. So, I won't bore you with details, but just off the top of my head, like trying to get somebody into hospital when they need sectioning, the waiting list is ridiculous. Like the possibility of getting somebody in hospital on the day they need to is almost nil. It so rarely happens. They usually have to go back to prison, sometimes for days at a time, before we can find a hospital bed. And it's been that way for pretty much the entire time that I've done court diversion, which has been a couple of years. And some of it is just lack of resources, but some of it is just pointless bureaucracy. But it does seem like it's really hard to challenge the system. There just seems to be layers and layers and layers of admin and managers to get through to change anything.
Yeah, and you point out how busy they are there and the backlogs and things like that. So they could very well be an aspect of this where you're talking about an overstretched NHS under pressure of its day-to-day activities, and it's faced with something which inspires a fair amount of incredulity. Yourself, until you saw the evidence laid out in front of you, said you weren't particularly convinced, which I find surprising that you had it. So what we're saying really is that even if you're really experienced in terms of human psychology and the crimes that can be committed, and you have that much experience, you can still be shocked by this sort of thing, and you can't get an instant read on a person who's capable of these sort of things. Because I think sometimes people obviously confuse psychology for some sort of incredible, almost mind and body reading technique, but that's not the case, is it?
No, not at all. And I'll be the first to admit. So, I handle these kind of cases for a living. I work as an expert witness. So I do psychiatric assessments. I give evidence in court. And Lucy Letby completely flabbergasted me because she's so different from almost every other defendant I've ever seen. I must have done over 500 criminal cases in my career, and I can think of maybe one or two where, like Lucy Letby, there doesn't seem to be any red flags. So she didn't have an antisocial history. She's not got a criminal record. She's not an argumentative or cantankerous person. She didn't have like problems in a relationship. She didn't argue or have difficult relationships with her peers. She was relatively popular. She seemed to be hardworking. There was no trauma in her background that we know of. Of course, it is possible that she did have trauma. We don't know about it. But, as far as we know, no physical, emotional, sexual abuse. So where has this come from? She doesn't have I was about to say she doesn't have mental illness. She did have background anxiety and depression, but I think that's a red herring. I don't think that's in any way relevant. It doesn't explain her behaviour. But she doesn't have a severe mental illness. So some of the women, I've assessed several women, a handful, who have killed children, sometimes their own children, and almost every single one of them, it has been in the context of severe mental illness. So, schizophrenia, they've had delusional beliefs about their babies, and they thought what they were doing was right in their head. They thought they were, for example, saving them for the afterworld. None of everything I've said is relevant to Lucy Letby. And so it's really hard for me to get my head around why she did what she did.
You described depression and anxiety as a red herring there, and I have no expertise or knowledge on this at all, but it would seem in a way that I suppose if you've got quite extreme or acute psychological issues of another nature, that may obviously inform some sort of depression or anxiety, maybe some sort of chicken and egg situation. So are you saying that the correlation really isn't much to go on when it comes to depression and anxiety?
So I suppose we have to demarcate the difference between correlation and causation, right? So if you're asking me, do people who commit offences have a high level of anxiety and depression? Absolutely. So the prevalence in prison, for example, is well over 50%. Easily, probably from my experience, coming up to 3/4 of most prisoners have some sort of anxiety or depression. Often it's relatively mild, so they might not even need medication, for example. But this is the crucial bit. The vast majority of people with anxiety and depression are still criminally culpable. The only time that I've seen it, and I have seen it a few times, but not that often, when they aren't, is when they have severe depression, so like psychotic depression. And with that, you get nihilistic delusions. So I've assessed a few people who believe that they're dying inside, or have set a house on fire as an act of suicide and have been charged that way, or they've tried to hurt somebody, again, like their own baby, like postnatal psychosis, for example, because of their delusional beliefs. But Lucy Letby did not have delusional beliefs. If she did, 100% that would have come out in the trial, and her defence team would have tried to put forward a psychiatric defence, and they didn't. So, she was she might have had depression. She might have had negative cognitions, like, pessimism for the future. She might have had like a generally negative outlook on life, like a lot of people with depression have. But that's a world away from it controlling your actions, so that you feel compelled to, like, kill a baby.
Yeah, I mean, one of the details that I don't even know why this jumped out at me, but it kind of registered, and it was that there was some sort of disciplinary hearings regarding accusations made about her within the NHS that actually obviously went in her favour at the time, and she brought her parents along with her to these meetings, and this kind of bringing your parents along thing I would sit right with me if you were talking about maybe a university student or somebody at college, school, obviously. A grown adult who's qualified in, the medical profession, taking their parents along, it just strikes me as a little bit strange. And I'm not sure if there's anything we can read into that at all, or whether it's just a bizarre piece of trivia.
I'm trying to think. I suppose it's a little odd. It is a little odd to have your parents with you on something like that. I wouldn't take my parents with me.
In a workplace dispute.
Yeah, but I don't think. So I'm trying to think how to word this. I think that it might be a little odd, but I think that if you looked at a cross section of most people that took their parents to something like that, most of them would be normal, typical, quote unquote. It does kind of show that she was perhaps very, very close to her parents and possibly a little bit too overfamiliar, maybe a bit smothered by them, maybe a bit kind of infantilized. But I don't think it's completely odd for I don't think it's completely odd for a grown woman to take their parents with them if they have that kind of close relationship.
What I always find strange about these things as well, I mean, I suppose this only works if you're not struggling from the same sort of maladies. But for me, it feels almost like she must have some sort of compulsion, because she's obviously smart enough to be medically trained. She understands the consequences of actions, especially medically. And there's also a quantity issue. You may get away with this kind of thing once, maybe. The amount of time she persisted with it, she must have deep down known. This is going to catch up with me. I think some of the notes she wrote at home kind of acknowledged that end. So what compels someone to go like completely beyond the realms of where you may actually get away with something this sinister?
Yeah. So I suppose there's a couple of ways of answering that question, Stephen. The first thing that I'm wondering, the first thing that I would ask is, does she have a mental illness, right? So I suppose that depends on how you define a mental illness. Most people, I think, would say, most lay people would say anybody who would do something as extreme as intentionally kill babies, or, for example, offend against children sexually, or carry out sexual assaults, or even, serial killers that kill adults. Anybody that does any of those things clearly is willing to commit extreme acts, and they don't have the usual moral kind of boundaries that we all have. So if you're saying that mental illness is that, then clearly Lucy Letby is that. I personally, as a psychiatrist, would only define mental illness as something that's diagnosable, that has clear symptoms. So, with depression, this lack of sleep, lack of energy, not enjoying something, or with schizophrenia, psychosis, hearing voices, etc., etc. But I suppose the most important definition is the legal definition. And that is to have a psychiatric defense like not guilty by reason of insanity. Either the person doesn't know what they were doing, like Lucy Letby physically didn't know she was killing babies, or she didn't know what she was doing was wrong. Clearly, she doesn't fit into any of those categories because she knew what she was doing, because it was calculated and it was planned. It takes effort to inject bags and try and cover up your tracks. And the very fact that she denied it the entire way through, and she tried to hide what she did, suggests to me that she did know what she was doing was wrong. So in the legal terminology, she doesn't meet a mental illness, so she doesn't have insanity. But to go back to your other point, I actually think kind of the opposite of you, Stephen. So I think she had these compulsions, but she got braver and braver because there was no consequence to them. So because the doctors raised them and ended up not only not being believed, but having to apologize to her in the first place, I think that kind of emboldened her. So she thought, well, why should I stop? For whatever pleasure it was giving her, whether it was something to do with the grieving process, there must have been some reason that she was doing it. So whatever her motivation was, why would you stop if you don't think in your head that you could be caught?
No, that makes perfect sense. Well, in any way that it's possible for this situation to make sense, of course. Now's a great time to throw some questions Dr. Dassey's way, and we'll see if he can answer them for you. So you mentioned Harold Shipman at the start of the conversation, and serial killers in general, unless I'm completely mistaken, overwhelmingly, and I think this is just true of violent crime particularly, is mostly carried out by men. often makes a story more shocking in the press when it is a woman at the heart of it. Are women sort of overrepresented in this sort of crime in terms of infanticide? Is that something that they do kind of skew higher than men on in general, or have I completely been given some false stats here?
No, you're right. So familicide is committed by men more, so killing your partner, your spouse, and your children. But just infanticide, so killing all your children or one child, is far more commonly done by women. And I don't know the exact proportion, but a very high proportion of them are done by people who are psychotic. So one case that really sort of pops into my mind, and I've done many videos on her, so I just know the case really well, is Andrea Yates. So she's a woman who, I think it was back in 2001, she killed 5 of her own children who were all very little, because she had schizophrenia, and she had these beliefs about them being marked by the devil. So that's a perfect example of a woman who is not, like a violent, antisocial person. She didn't have a criminal record, but purely because of mental illness, she committed infanticide. So yeah, that's usually the context that it occurs in. So it's either that, or it can be like jealousy. So like a man, and this is usually by a man whose wife is leaving him with the children, so he just annihilates the entire family, or annihilates just the children.
So we've got a great question here by Jake Ford, and it sort of plays into that "he was such a quiet man" trope. The question is, how unusual is it for there to be no warning signs in a serial killer's history?
So I would say it is very unusual. The vast majority of people that commit violent crimes, particularly murder, and particularly multiple murders, so serial killers, there's almost always some kind of trauma. So sometimes it can be as simple as being physically or sexually abused. Sometimes it can be neglect. Sometimes it can be bullying, or there's something that causes them to have an inferiority complex. There are definitely some cases where that is not, where we know there hasn't been trauma, but I would say it's relatively rare.
It's such a tragic aspect of this, isn't it, really, where you can be a complete innocent victim of these sort of crimes, and as a result of that, go on to sort of perpetrate them yourself.
Yeah. But obviously, most people who do suffer from those forms of abuse don't end up becoming criminals or severely violent criminals. So that's just one element of the puzzle, I think. I think there's so many other things like opportunism, your own personality traits, like being impulsive and aggressive naturally. So there's so many kind of different factors at play, but that's absolutely one of them, yeah.
Another question from the judicial standpoint: are we at a stage where we can say she did it beyond reasonable doubt? Is there enough evidence? Are others culpable in this too, higher ups, management, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's something that I think a lot of people are debating. I mean, I suppose when I was thinking, when I very first heard about the accusations against Lucy Letby, first of all, I didn't believe it was possible that somebody like her would do something like this. So again, somebody without all these red flag warnings, without a history of antisocial behavior, without trauma. Then the more I heard about it, I thought, well, even though there's no direct evidence and it's circumstantial, it's pretty strong evidence, isn't it? So I believe the killings occurred during the night shift, when she was on night shift. Then she was changed to a day shift, and they started occurring during the day. Then she was taken off into the admin role. Then they stopped. So I mean, that in itself is pretty damning, isn't it? But to answer the question, is it beyond reasonable doubt? It took a long time for the jury to come back with a verdict. That's something that surprised me a little bit. I mean, I suppose if you're being really pedantic, you could say that if it took that long, then there must have been some doubt, right? Because otherwise it would have been much quicker. But I suppose I, perhaps naively, am trusting in the judicial system. So I'm trusting that if a jury of 12 people, I think it was 11 in the end, wasn't it, looked at the case so long, so hard, and it being one of the biggest cases of modern times, I'm sure they would have taken it seriously. So I believe that the right decision was made. Do you think there's any possibility that there was reasonable doubt?
I think we like simple shapes to fit in neat holes, don't we? And I think we're just missing that sort of smoking gun aspect to it. From a logical perspective, it seems overwhelmingly likely that she's guilty of it. And I suppose when you factor in the handwritten notes they found at home, which kind of served as a mini confession in a way, I'm up there at like 95%, but it doesn't feel particularly clean, does it? Considering she's still obviously protesting her innocence.
Yeah, and the reasonable doubt's supposed to be 99%. So you're supposed to be 99% sure. That's what they say. And on the balance of probabilities for the civil court case is 51%.
So I mean, I'm assuming she'll have the right to appeal then.
Yeah. But I think for the appeal, if I'm not mistaken, there has to be like a legal point. So she can't just appeal because she doesn't like the verdict. She has to say that something was misjudged.
How would you go about making that argument, though? I mean, who gets to make the decision?
I think that her legal team would try and find what they think would be the biggest chink in the prosecution's case. So, for example, this is speculating. Say that they believe that the jury was unduly influenced by newspaper reports of Lucy Letby, for example. So the defense would write to the judge first of all, and if the judge thinks that that's a fair point, so the judge doesn't make the decision there and then, but he looks at the letter, he or she looks at the letter and says that is a fair point where evidence could be brought from both sides and it could be discussed, then they decide to allow the appeal. But if it's something that's completely ridiculous that can't be proven, for example, then the judge will refuse the appeal.
But what is it to say for people who tend to somehow pursue? I mean, obviously, it's not common. The overwhelming majority of medical professionals are caring, empathetic people, and have taken up that profession because they want to help people, clearly. But there are those kind of jobs that will appeal to people looking to commit crimes like this. You look at, obviously it's things like the guides, things like that, scouts, people who want to prey on children, school teachers as well. And these are all very laudable professions, overwhelmingly staffed by people who care about what they do, but they are exploited by the kind of people who would get free range to do, carry out atrocities this way. I mean, how can we explain that kind of aspect beyond the obvious?
Yeah. So as well as everything you've mentioned, Stephen, there's also care homes. So there was, as I'm sure you know, a spate of controversies about people who worked in those kind of environments, psychiatric units who are actually very physically abusive. So I suppose it's quite an uncomfortable truth, but there are people that will gravitate towards those kinds of jobs just simply for the opportunity. There will be childhood sex offenders who work on children's units. There will be people who want to, who are sexual predators, who will work with vulnerable people who might be mentally ill, might have like a learning disability, for example, because they simply want to commit their crimes. I suppose we just have to be really, really vigilant, don't we? So, I mean, the NHS and caring professions already do background checks. I'm not convinced that they're particularly that strong. So there was the case of that policeman, is it Provan, his name, who was charged this week with sexual offences, and he passed all of the checks despite the fact that he'd offended in between the police background checks. So I think that's one thing we need to do, is do that more thoroughly. But to me, the Lucy Letby case is relatively straightforward in that the management didn't take the concerns of the doctors seriously. So it's one thing to actually notice that things are going wrong, which I think was done very slowly. But to me, even more importantly than that, once complaints were raised, they weren't taken seriously. So what I'm trying to say is there's no point having safeguards and systems if management decide to just ignore them.
Yeah, and I suppose we spoke about the idea of the NHS just trying to avoid a massive PR disaster, which was a terrible, appalling, unjustifiable decision. But the flip side of that is, I do feel like people will lose trust in the NHS over this story as well. So I suppose there is some, the motivations were completely wrong, but the logic still tracks to some extent, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't, because if the outcome is what happened, so another way of saying that is if the managers suspected, I don't think they knew, but if they suspected that one of the nurses was killing babies, then surely the PR fallout is 100 times worse if that has happened and it comes out that they didn't do anything, than if it has happened and it came out that they tried their best to help with the investigation.
Yeah, I mean, are people losing sort of trust in a lot of our institutions? We mentioned the police there, some high profile cases over the last few years of male police officers since seriously abusing their power in the worst possible ways. We're having this coming out of the NHS. We're having sort of clinics shut down that have been making some appalling decisions based on some sort of gender ideology. Are people losing a bit of, we have a scandal from the government every couple of weeks. Are we losing trust in institutions in general?
I think we are in general. I think, and maybe this is me being a bit naive and maybe not fully objective because I work in the NHS, but I think the Met Police and the government have got a far worse rap recently than the NHS because there's been so many more scandals. There's been, especially the Met Police, well, actually both the government as well. There's been controversy after controversy after controversy. So many things have happened. With the NHS, things should never happen, and they have happened. There's the whole Winterbourne scandal, now this, but I think they're less often. So they don't happen a few times a year. They happen once every few years. I mean, just to be crystal clear, I'm not excusing any of these outrageous kind of controversies. I'm just saying, because they don't happen quite as often, and because the NHS is put up on this pedestal that we discussed before, I don't think people have lost faith in it yet. I think it's possible that this might be, the straw that broke the camel's back. But I don't think the NHS is judged as much as other institutions.
All right, Dr. Shaun, Daz, it's been lovely to speak to you again. We never have enough time, unfortunately, but maybe you can just let people know where they can find your YouTube channel and writing.
Lovely to talk to you, Stephen. So yeah, it's called A Psych for Sore Minds. I've got quite a few videos about Lucy Letby. I've done things like analyse people that go after internet scanners, that kind of thing. So anything to do with mental illness or offending, or the crossover between the two. Love to see some of your viewers there. A Psych for Sore Minds.
Wonderful, and that's all in the show notes for everybody. It's been great to speak to you again.
Cheers, Stephen. All the best.
You
Goodbye.
too. Bye.